The wind moves differently across the plains of northwestern Anatolia at night. It does not rush. It circles, low and patient, brushing the grass as if searching for something lost beneath it. I remember that wind. I was young then, standing watch along a timber palisade that creaked with every breath of darkness. Beyond us, the Byzantine frontier towns flickered like distant embers, unaware that history was already leaning in their direction. Our camp was small, almost unimpressive. No marble columns, no shining ranks of imperial soldiers, only rough tents stitched from goat hair, horses tied to crooked posts, and men who had crossed from the fading lands of the Seljuks into a border world no one fully controlled. At the center of it all stood Osman, not yet the name that would echo through centuries, just a frontier lord with measured eyes and a voice that rarely rose. People later spoke of destiny as if the earth itself had chosen him. I never heard him speak of destiny. I heard him speak of pasture land, of loyalty, of the weakness of distant emperors who taxed villages they could no longer protect. He spoke quietly, as if discussing weather, but when he finished, men leaned closer to him rather than away. That is how it began, not with thunder, but with gravity. We were not conquerors in those first nights. We were raiders on the edges of a crumbling map. The Byzantine garrisons along Bithynia were thin, their commanders arguing with Constantinople over unpaid wages and unfulfilled promises. The empire that had once terrified continents was now bargaining with its own survival. In those fractures, Osman saw space. I carried messages between tents and watched alliances form over bowls of sour milk. Turkmen tribes drifting west after Mongol storms needed protection and land. Osman offered both. In return, he asked for obedience and readiness. There was no grand proclamation, just an understanding that survival required movement, and movement required unity under one banner. The first time I rode with them toward a Byzantine outpost, I expected chaos. Instead, there was patience. Scouts moved ahead, observing fields and walls, measuring response times. Osman had learned from Seljuk commanders and from the Mongols who had reshaped the region. He valued information more than spectacle. When we struck, it was swift and deliberate, aimed at supply lines and isolated forts rather than crowded cities. Word traveled faster than our horses. Greek peasants whispered of new raiders who sometimes spared villages that opened their gates. Some fled, others negotiated. Osman understood that fear alone did not hold territory. He allowed local leaders to remain if they accepted his authority. Taxes shifted hands, but daily life often did not. It was unsettling in its simplicity. In the evenings, I would sit near the fires and listen to the older Ghazis speak of faith and frontier duty. They believed they stood at the edge of two worlds, pushing one back and expanding the other. Yet the reality felt less poetic. We were men balancing hunger and ambition, faith and practicality. The line between sacred purpose and political calculation was thin, and Osman walked it carefully. As seasons turned, the small wooden fortifications we built did not vanish, they multiplied. Each victory secured grazing routes, then trade paths. Each trade path brought revenue, and revenue brought more fighters. It was not glory that fed the growth, it was structure, a quiet architecture of control laid plank by plank across contested soil. Years later, when people would speak of the birth of an empire, they would imagine banners snapping against the sky and armies marching in perfect formation. I remember, instead, the smell of damp earth and the steady voice of a man who rarely shouted. The domination of the Ottomans did not begin with a roar. It began with a listening silence, and that silence was spreading. When Osman died, the camp did not erupt into mourning the way ballads later claimed. There were no grand displays, no wailing crowds stretching across the hills. There was a stillness, as if everyone understood that grief, if indulged too loudly, might fracture what had only just begun to harden. I stood outside the wooden hall in Sirte and watched men measure their faces before stepping inside. Orhan, his son, did not inherit a throne carved in stone. He inherited momentum. The frontier was no longer a loose scattering of raids. It was a growing organism with roots in captured towns and negotiated loyalties. The Byzantines were still present, still formidable in memory, but their authority had thinned along the edges. Orhan saw that thinning like a seam waiting to be pulled. The siege of Bursa did not feel like legend while we endured it. It felt like hunger and mud. Months pressed against the city walls. We cut supply lines and watched the defenders ration grain. No dramatic assaults every sunrise, just pressure, the kind that tightens slowly until something inside gives way. When Bursa finally yielded in 1326, it was less a collapse than an exhaustion. Inside the city, nothing gleamed as conquerors imagined. Shops reopened cautiously, churches remained standing. Orhan did not burn the streets to announce his power. He declared Bursa his capital and began to build institutions rather than bonfires. Markets were reorganized, taxes were standardized, a mint began striking coins in his name. Authority, once abstract, took on weight. I remember the first silver akçe I held. It was small, unimpressive, but it carried a quiet revolution. Coins travel where soldiers cannot. They move through hands, across borders, into memory. With currency came predictability. With predictability came loyalty. The Ottoman Beylik was no longer a restless frontier band. It was becoming a state, though few of us dared use that word. Orhan formed a more disciplined infantry, drawing from those willing to bind themselves permanently to his service. The cavalry remained swift and tribal, but something new was forming beneath it, a steadier backbone. Training replaced improvisation, command chains clarified. It was subtle, yet I could feel the change in the way orders were given and obeyed without hesitation. Beyond Anatolia, the Byzantine Empire wrestled with its own shadows. Civil wars split Constantinople's attention. Rival claimants begged for allies, even from those they once dismissed as raiders. I carried letters between camps where Greek nobles negotiated with Orhan, promising territory in exchange for military support. The frontier had reversed itself. Now emperors sought us. Crossing into Europe for the first time felt unreal. Gallipoli was not taken in a blaze of theatrical conquest, but through opportunity born of Byzantine internal conflict and an earthquake that weakened its defenses. When our banners appeared across the Dardanelles, it was as though the horizon itself had shifted. The Ottomans were no longer confined to one shore. Villages in Thrace watched us with wary curiosity. Some resisted and were subdued. Others submitted in exchange for protection against rival lords. The pattern repeated: minimal destruction, maximum incorporation. It was domination by absorption as much as by force. I began to understand that Orhan's true weapon was not the sword at his hip, but the patience in his strategy. By the time gray crept into my beard, the campfires of my youth had transformed into administrative centers and fortified towns, stretching across 2 continents. The wind that once circled a fragile palisade now carried the sounds of markets and marching drills. What had started as a frontier gamble was turning into something heavier, more deliberate, and it was not slowing. By the time Murad took command, the frontier no longer felt like a frontier. It felt like a tightening circle. I had grown older, slower, but I remained close enough to watch the change in posture among our leaders. Murad did not speak softly the way his father had. He listened less, calculated more, and saw beyond single cities toward entire regions. Edirne became the new center of gravity after its capture in 1361. The city was not chosen for beauty, it was chosen for position. From there, the Balkans opened like a map laid flat on a table. Roads led into Serbia, Bulgaria, and beyond. Murad understood that control of roads meant control of futures. But roads do not hold themselves. Resistance gathered. Balkan lords, wary of Ottoman expansion, forged alliances. They had their own rivalries, but fear can briefly silence old grudges. I remember hearing rumors of a coalition forming, nobles swearing oaths beneath church vaults, promising to halt what they saw as an eastern tide. The battle near the Maritsa River in 1371 did not unfold as a glorious epic. It unfolded at night. Ottoman forces struck the Allied camp with brutal efficiency. Panic spread before strategy could respond. By dawn, the coalition had collapsed. The river carried more than water that morning. It carried a message. After Maritsa, submission came more quickly, not always willingly, but more predictably. Some rulers retained their thrones as vassals, paying tribute and sending sons to Ottoman courts. It was a quiet exchange, autonomy traded for survival. Murad preferred layered authority over constant annihilation. He understood the burden of overextension. Yet something else was forming beneath this expansion. A new corps of soldiers, recruited through the Devshirme system, began to appear. Christian boys taken from Balkan villages, converted, trained, reshaped into disciplined infantry loyal only to the Sultan. They were not bound by tribe or family, they were bound by institution. I watched their drills in Edirne. Their movements were synchronized, their obedience immediate. There was no debate in their eyes, no hesitation born of divided loyalties. The Janissaries were not just soldiers, they were a statement that the Ottoman state could manufacture loyalty where blood ties once ruled. In 1389, on the plain of Kosovo, that system faced its sternest test. The coalition of Balkan forces gathered once more, determined to push back. The field was vast and uneven, dotted with banners that fluttered in uneasy anticipation. The clash that followed was brutal, intimate, and confusing. Victory did not arrive cleanly. Murad himself was killed after the battle, struck down in the aftermath by a Serbian noble. The news moved through the ranks like a tremor. A sultan dead on the field. Yet the army did not fracture. Command shifted swiftly to Bayezid. The structure held. That more than the outcome of Kosovo, revealed the depth of transformation. As we buried the fallen and counted the cost, I realized something unsettling. The Ottomans no longer depended on a single man's charisma. They depended on a system that absorbed shock and continued forward. Domination was no longer a question of bold raids or lucky alliances. It had become mechanical, almost inevitable, and that inevitability pressed outward into lands that had once seemed unreachable.
Bayezid moved faster than any ruler I had served under. They called him Yildirim, lightning, and the name was not poetry, it was tempo. Where Murad had advanced with measured consolidation, Bayezid preferred compression. He tightened control over Anatolia, pressing rival beyliks into submission with relentless campaigns that left little room for negotiation. I rode behind columns that did not pause long enough for the dust to settle. Fortresses that once seemed distant were taken in rapid succession. Some surrendered at the mere rumor of his approach. Others resisted and were overwhelmed. Bayezid did not always favor the patient absorption of his predecessors. At times, he demanded immediate allegiance. In the Balkans, vassal states felt the strain. Tribute increased, expectations sharpened. The Ottoman court in Edirne grew more formal, more imperial. Ceremonies lengthened, titles expanded. It was as if the state, having proven its endurance, now wished to display its authority openly. The quiet frontier humility was fading. Yet power invites challenge. In 1396, a crusading army assembled in Europe, encouraged by the papacy and led by Hungarian and French nobles. They marched toward Nicopolis with confidence sharpened by pride. I remember the whispers in camp, the recognition that this was no minor coalition, this was a statement. The battle that followed was fierce and chaotic. The Crusaders charged with chivalric fury, believing momentum alone would break Ottoman lines. But discipline held. The Janissaries anchored the defense, while cavalry units encircled. By evening, the coalition had collapsed under its own overconfidence. Prisoners were taken in numbers that darkened the horizon. Victory at Nicopolis echoed across continents. The Ottomans were no longer a regional force pressing against weakened borders. They were a power capable of defeating a united European host. Yet even in triumph, I sensed tension beneath Bayezid's expression. His gaze drifted eastward more often than west. In Anatolia, another storm gathered. Timur, the conqueror from Central Asia, advanced with an army hardened by campaigns across Persia and beyond. His reputation preceded him like a shadow stretching over the land. Cities fell before his approach. Refugees streamed west, carrying stories of devastation that made even seasoned warriors uneasy. When Bayezid and Timur met near Ankara in 1402, the air felt heavier than any battlefield I had known. Allies wavered. Some Anatolian contingents defected mid-conflict, recalling older loyalties. The Ottoman lines faltered under pressure from a force both disciplined and vast. For the first time in decades, inevitability fractured. Bayezid was captured. The Sultan, who moved like lightning, now sat in confinement. News of his defeat spread faster than his earlier victories. Provinces trembled. Vassals reconsidered their positions. The empire that seemed unstoppable revealed its vulnerability in a single afternoon, and that revelation settled over us like an unwelcome truth. As I returned to Edirne,
older and heavier with memory, I felt the machinery of domination hesitate. It did not collapse outright, but it groaned under uncertainty. For years we had believed expansion was a natural law. Now we understood it was fragile, dependent on cohesion that could unravel without warning. And the unraveling had begun.
After Ankara, the empire did not shatter in a single clean break. It loosened. Like fabric pulled too hard at one corner, threads began separating in uneven directions. Bayezid's sons turned on one another, each claiming legitimacy, each gathering supporters from provinces that only months earlier had spoken with one voice. I remained in Edirne and watched uncertainty settle like dust on abandoned armor. Suleiman held Rumelia first, ruling from the European side with careful diplomacy. He courted Byzantine support, negotiated truces, and tried to present himself as the reasonable heir. Across the straits, his brothers maneuvered through Anatolia, forging alliances with beyliks that had once been forced into obedience. Old rivalries resurfaced with quiet vengeance. For common soldiers and townspeople, the interregnum was less about dynastic claims and more about survival. Tax collectors arrived under different banners depending on the month. Garrisons shifted loyalty. Markets faltered when caravans feared instability along trade routes. It was not dramatic collapse, it was slow erosion. In those years, I often thought of the early days under Osman. Back then, weakness belonged to others. Now it crept through our own foundations. Yet something resisted total disintegration. The administrative practices established in Bursa and Edirne did not vanish overnight. Records were still kept, judges still presided, coins still circulated. Mehmed, the youngest son, moved differently from his brothers. He did not command the largest forces at first, nor did he possess the loudest supporters. Instead, he secured Anatolia piece by piece, negotiating when possible, fighting when necessary. He seemed to understand that exhaustion favored the patient. One by one, his rivals fell. Suleiman was defeated and killed. Musa arose and then collapsed beneath shifting alliances. By 1413, Mehmed stood as sole ruler, later called Mehmed I. His victory did not feel like celebration. It felt like stabilization after a fever. The empire exhaled cautiously. Mehmed did not rush into grand conquests. He repaired. He restored relationships with Balkan vassals, reaffirmed control over Anatolia, and rebuilt trust in institutions strained by civil war. I saw him walk through Edirne without theatrical display, listening more than speaking. He understood that domination without cohesion was illusion. The Janissaries remained loyal through the turmoil, their identity tied to the state rather than a single prince. That loyalty had preserved continuity when bloodlines fractured. It was a quiet testament to the structural choices made decades earlier. The system bent but did not break. As trade resumed and borders steadied, confidence returned in measured increments. The memory of Ankara lingered, however, like a scar beneath clothing. Everyone knew how quickly momentum could reverse. That knowledge altered the tone of governance. Expansion would come again, but not with the careless certainty of Bayezid's lightning. When Mehmed died and his son Murad II succeeded him, the empire felt steadier than it had in years. Yet beneath that steadiness lay experience carved by humiliation and recovery. Domination, we had learned, was not merely the act of conquering others, it was the discipline
of surviving oneself, and that discipline was becoming instinct. By the time Murad II secured his rule, I no longer rode with the cavalry. I walked slowly along the walls of Edirne and listened to younger men speak of campaigns as if they were seasonal rituals. The empire had regained its balance, but it carried memory now, like a healed bone that still aches before rain. Murad governed with caution shaped by inherited scars. Rebellions surfaced early in his reign. Pretenders claimed legitimacy. Balkan rulers tested Ottoman resolve. In 1444, a crusading force once again marched toward Ottoman territory, encouraged by shifting alliances and the belief that instability lingered. Murad had briefly abdicated in favor of his young son Mehmed, seeking retreat from endless conflict. History refused him rest. The Crusaders advanced toward Varna, confident that prior Ottoman fractures had left permanent weakness. Instead, they met an army reorganized and resolute. The battle was violent, close, and decisive. The death of the Hungarian king Vladislav III shattered the coalition's resolve. Murad resumed the throne, not out of hunger for power, but necessity. In the years that followed, Murad tightened control across the Balkans and Anatolia without spectacle. Fortresses were reinforced, vassal obligations clarified, trade networks stabilized under predictable taxation. He did not chase reckless expansion, he cultivated durability. It was a different kind of domination, less dazzling, more enduring. When Murad died in 1451, his son Mehmed II inherited not a fragile frontier, but a disciplined state spanning 2 continents. I was an old man then, watching from the shadow of a market archway as messengers carried news of the young sultan's ambitions. He spoke openly of Constantinople, the city that had lingered in Ottoman vision for generations. The siege of 1453 did not feel like the impulsive strike of early raiders. It felt like the culmination of accumulated structure. Massive cannons forged under expert supervision pounded walls once thought impregnable. Naval maneuvers sealed the Golden Horn. Logistics flowed with precision learned through decades of adaptation. When the city finally fell, the moment was less triumphant than heavy. Churches were converted, yes, but neighborhoods remained inhabited. Mehmed declared himself Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome, signaling continuity as much as conquest. He invited artisans and merchants to repopulate the capital, understanding that empty grandeur holds no power. I walked through Constantinople months later and saw markets reopening beneath damaged domes. Greek, Armenian, Jewish, and Muslim communities negotiated new realities under Ottoman oversight. The empire did not erase what it conquered. It layered itself atop it, absorbing traditions while imposing authority. Domination became integration, shaped by hierarchy. The Janissaries, once an experiment, now stood as pillars of a centralized military machine. Provincial governors answered to a bureaucratic corps that had evolved from Osman's modest council. Law codes grew more systematic. Revenue was cataloged carefully. What began as improvisation had matured into administration. Now, in the quiet of my final years, I think back to that wind on the Anatolian plain. We believed we were merely surviving at the edge of someone else's empire. Instead, we were laying foundations in silence. The Ottoman armies did not begin by overpowering the world. They began by learning how to endure, adapt, and bind men into something larger than themselves. And that binding never truly loosened.